Hi, everybody. Thanks for your patience. We had a couple of little technical glitches there, but I think we've mostly got them under control now. It's my great pleasure to introduce Melania. I had the privilege of working with Melania for, I think it would have been about a year, and I have an interesting story to tell about her. She's currently head of behavioral science and cognitive analytics at IBM. And working with Melania, we were working in the behavioral science space. And when I got to know her better, I asked the question that you always have in the back of your mind about a behavioral scientist. Have you used your behavioral science wiles on persuading me that this is a good thing to do? And her answer was yes. So you have been warned. Watch this with interest, and it's over to you, Melania.
Well, thank you, Arthur. I hadn't remembered that story, and so when you started telling it, I started freaking out a little bit and what my response to that question had been. But that was many years ago, and I'm glad I was just as cheeky then as I am now. So, hi everyone. I'm so happy to be here, and thank you, Arthur, for having me. Really hoping that the technology works for us today. If not, we will see how this goes. But my role in providing this session for you guys and talking to you guys today is to really dig deep into the science of behavior change in a rapidly changing world. And this is specifically within the context of climate change. My day-to-day and my role is very much grounded in behavioral science. My background is entirely in behavioral science in that I have a master's and PhD in cognitive neuroscience. So I've spent a very long time sort of studying the inner workings of the brain and why people behave the way that they do, and sort of the deviations between what people intend to do and how they actually behave. And this is an interesting problem in its own right. And it's something that I think all of us contemplate in our day-to-day. It becomes especially interesting when we're talking about problems like climate change, where there are a lot of dynamics in play and that people are very emotionally invested. There's a lot of polarization on beliefs. There is a dynamic at play between the short term and the long term, which traditionally we as people are very bad at making those trade-offs accordingly, because we tend to favor the present at the future, or the discount of the future. Even if we know that the future is obviously incredibly important. And so what I'm going to talk to you guys about today is sort of how we use behavioral science in solving some of these problems, how we can think about it at a systematic level, how it can be incorporated into systems level thinking as we think about behavior change as it relates to climate change. And then, of course, I've got my email at the end there, because I'm very happy to chat if anybody has any questions after. Not only do I do behavior change in my day-to-day and obviously have my hands really well rooted on the analytics and AI side of things, but I spent a number of years at a sustainability behavior change consulting firm, and I actually sit on the Sustainability Executive Task Force at IBM as well, which is responsible for really driving the IBM response to climate change. So hopefully what I have prepared for you guys is interesting, and of course happy to have questions after. So we'll dig right into the content, specifically starting with the notion of when we are trying to solve a problem, where do we begin? And whenever we're trying to solve this problem from a human behavior perspective, we tend to start with an analysis. Now, this analysis is sometimes very simplistic in terms of asking a number of questions, or doing group interviews or focus groups or ethnographic research, all the way through to being very complex analytics modeling, something from a correlation all the way through to structural equation modeling and very advanced analytics and AI models that allow us to really understand why people behave the way that they do. And the reason for this is because we want to fundamentally understand, why do people behave the way that they do in a current situation, so we can better then plan for how we want to respond. And the reason this becomes especially challenging, and why analytics is not the only solution, and why asking people how they want to behave or what they want to do in the future is not the only solution or understanding to the future state, that is because how people behave at any one moment in time is so incredibly tied to their context That's why this problem is so hard to solve. And that's because people, how they behave or how they feel in a situation is very different. For example, if they are sitting, on a balcony sipping some coconut juice in a very warm environment, is very different to how people feel when they are standing in a crowd at a live music environment, which is very different to how people feel when they are at the start of the year, planning out their goals, planning out their resolutions towards, for example, at the end of the year when they are reflecting on the year that they have had and starting to think about the year going forward. Just as like how on a Monday we feel incredibly different to how we feel on a Friday. And I'm sorry that the slides are lagging here a little bit. So how we feel at the beginning of the week is very different to how we feel at the end. Or for example, how we feel at the beginning of a day is very different to how we feel at the end. Or for example, we might start the day saying that, we aren't going to have those lovely cupcakes, but by the end of the day, we end up indulging in them. And what's actually incredibly interesting is me even showing you a picture of a cupcake can fundamentally change the way that you feel at that moment in time. It can inspire hunger. Hunger drives all sorts of byproduct effects in how we think about pros and cons and how we understand a situation. Sounds very simple, but has dramatic implications on how we actually behave. So much to the point, actually, where if you walk into a grocery store when you are hungry, your bill is more likely to be, is 67% higher than if you were to walk into a grocery store with not feeling hunger. So that old wives' tale is very much true. So how we behave in a situation is very dependent on the situation itself that we find ourselves in, the people who surround us, and how we feel. And that's why cracking the behavior change problem is such a problem for the ages, if you will. And this is why, as behavioral scientists, we tend to always say that context is king. And the more we can understand the context, we can better understand how we can actually solve the problem. So as a behavioral science team, we study the variability in context and how that leads to very predictable patterns in behavior. And we do this in order to better understand the why behind the problems that we face, and in turn inform how we create solutions that inspire change in stakeholder behavior. And the way that we do this, the way that we form our understanding of context and the importance of context from a systematic point of view on then predicting behavior, is we bring together foundational models that are true to the business requirements or the solution that we are solving for our client at that particular time. But we merge that with models from behavior or models of behavior from social psychology, from cognitive and emotional neuroscience, and from the foundational tenets of behavioral economics to really understand the broader picture and provide a more cohesive understanding to what the data is telling us itself. And so the power of behavioral and behavioral science very much lies in the ability to unlock and disentangle some of the assumptions that underlie around how people behave, and more importantly, how those assumptions that we have about how people behave are eroding our actual ability to deliver value. I'm gonna dig into this for a few seconds here, just so that you guys fully understand. I know I'm speaking, but I also know that the slides are delaying. And so I just want to make sure that I'm reiterating these points so you guys are really grasping. As a cognitive neuroscientist, I'm very empathetic to the fact that you guys are processing a lot with the delay in slide, as well as the over sort of the narrative over top. So what else? I'll take a moment to just crystallize this thought for you. When we are trying to understand the future state and when we are trying to solve a problem, we are very good within business, and this is very true of the traditional mindset within business and operating models in a traditional mindset. We are very good at the numbers and the facts. We're very good at building business cases that are grounded in numbers and in work streams. We foundationally tend to caveat a lot of the assumptions around human behavior into a line item. And in that line item, we have a bunch of assumptions about, yes, okay, people will adopt, or yes, a customer will engage. And we might have some number that we define there in the model, and there's an asterisk there saying, well, given all these different caveats and conditions. That fundamentally erodes our ability to deliver value, to expect value, to estimate value, and to actually capture that value. And so if you can bring a scientific lens to better articulate what those assumptions are, it changes the game in terms of understanding what we should actually be estimating, but it also changes the game in terms of how we then design that solution for change. So moving on to the actual predictable patterns of behavior, which is the point in time when people usually say to me, I am not predictable. Other people might be, but I am not. One of my favorite examples of this is the case of the messy desk. So if I was to ask a lot of you to raise your hand, if we were in person, to raise your hand and say, how many of you actually want your desk to look something like this, very clean and crisp, no garbage. But if I was asked you to keep your hand up, if your desk actually looks something like this, right? By the end of the day, it's messy. You've got your Post-it notes everywhere. There's garbage everywhere. Even though you have the best intention to have a clean desk, by the end of the day, it ends up looking something like this. And this is due to one of the most foundational principles of human behavior, which is the intention-action gap. And this is the foundational gap between the intentions, our better angels, our idealistic sense of self, and the way that we actually behave. And that gap is incredibly important and pervasive in our life. There's a gap, for example, in our New Year's resolutions and the difference between the goals that we set and being able to actually achieve them. There's a gap potentially between our intention to make a coffee at home instead of going out to a coffee shop every day and spending $7 to get that coffee. There's a gap between our intention to clear out our inbox at the end of the day and the number of emails that actually remain. And that's because life is really messy. We might make our intentions with the understanding that life is one straight line, one logical progression, one stepwise function, when in reality, it looks more like a messy ball of yarn with no real rhyme or reason other than the fact that the sun rises at the beginning of the day and it sets at the end. And so when I talk about the intention-action gap, what's incredible is that it's such a pervasive phenomenon within psychology, in all facets of psychology, that it's been studied at the meta-analysis level to an incredible degree. One of my favorite papers actually looked at over 500 different studies in a number of different well-being studies, so financial well-being, emotional well-being, and physical well-being, and was able to show that actually only 28% of behavior was actually predicted by intentions. So this means that 72% of our behavior is actually driven by something else. And that something else is context. So I talked to you earlier about the importance of context being king, and habits. And the reason I'm adding habits into the conversation now is because habits so often drive the context that we tend to find ourselves in. Okay, those are two highly correlated elements, and we can get into the philosophy of that at another point in time. And why this is relevant specifically to the conversation around climate change is because the intention-action gap is perfectly mirrored in another phenomenon known as the value-action gap. So intention are our intentions and how we want to behave and how we want to move in society. That same gap exists in the values that we hold true to our moral compass and sense of self and the way that we actually act in the world. This is incredibly important when we start talking about sustainability, sustainable behaviors, changing your behavior to serve the collective good, right? Taking the train versus driving your car. And I should say I'm not actually sure about the carbon emissions relative to those two, but I believe I'm correct in saying that the carbon emissions per individual or per capita is better on the train than driving. But a common analysis, nonetheless, when we talk about the good that you can do on your day-to-day to change for the collective good. There is a gap there between our value and the way that we actually behave. And there's a number of really interesting phenomena that are measured here. One of them is called the fudge factor, or specifically values as it relates to telling the truth. It's something like 90% of adults can't go longer than 10 minutes without telling a lie. And I do like to say that this is an American statistic, and as a Canadian, maybe we're a little bit better, although that's probably not true because it is human nature. Just to say that we don't wake up in the morning wanting to lie. It's just context and habits, and the world throws us for a loop, and we end up acting a little bit differently. But this is incredibly important when we're talking about sustainable behavior change. So there's this important piece in the fact that 72% of our behavior is actually driven by context and is driven by habits. And so I like to talk about this as not the intention action gap, but actually the expectation reality gap. And that when we're talking about setting up programs, setting up initiatives, building business cases, making strategic decision making, we set an expectation about where we want the future state, what we want the future state to look like, and how we're going to get there based on the intentions of the people who are involved. And so the intention action gap, as it lives and breathes in the boardrooms or in our organizations and our NGOs and our institutions around the world, can be very viscerally felt as the expectation reality gap. And this is important because the gap is very well defined by behavioral science. It gives us a good set of tools to understand when is that gap more likely to occur, when is it less likely to occur. And that's what I want to talk to you guys about next. So I'll just switch slides here. One of the great ways to think about the gap and when it's most likely to occur, and maybe this is something that will resonate with you guys. For example, how many of you wake up in the morning, it's 8:45 a.m., you sit down at your desk, maybe some of you get there a little bit earlier than 8:45, maybe some of you get there a little bit later, but you're at your desk, and in your mind, you are going to have the most productive day. You have your to-do list, you're feeling good, you've had your coffee. But by about, 3:45, maybe you've meandered over to the couch. Maybe you're looking at the news on your phone. Maybe for some of you, that's social media. And you've sort of deviated from that plan. And then by the time the evening rolls around, you're gorging on those cupcakes and enjoying those treats, or binging on Netflix, which you promised yourself at the beginning of the day you wouldn't do. Another alternative is that you didn't go to the gym in the way that you expected to. And this is because of something very foundational to when that gap is more likely to be wide, which is grounded in the principle of cognitive and emotional capacity. We as humans have a limited or a finite capacity on which we can cognitively process information and the degree to which we can emotionally regulate ourselves. And emotional regulation and cognitive capacity are the two foundational tenets in whether or not we will close that gap between our intention and our actual behavior. And so you can sort of think about it as your coffee cup being full or your coffee cup being empty. I like to say, like, at the beginning of the day, you have a full coffee cup in your actual mug, but the same is true within your neural capacity, both on the emotional and the cognitive side. And by the time you start deviating from that path, it's because your cognitive juice, your coffee cup, is fundamentally empty and you no longer have that capacity. That's why at the beginning of the day, if you deal with a stressful event, whether that's with a family member or with a colleague, in the morning, a lot of us can handle it with Zen. We can handle it in an emotionally strong and regulated and rational way. But that same experience happening in the afternoon can elicit an entirely different response from us. And that's because emotional and cognitive capacity are excessively depleted by anxiety, stress, and fatigue. It effectively operates as kicking over that coffee cup and emptying it above and beyond the traditional decline that you would see with the rise and the fall of the sun anyway. And so I just want us to take a moment here as sort of like a collective understanding and a collective breath to say that the experience that we are having right now after 2 years of a global pandemic, where we are working and our children are at home with us, sitting under our desk while we are trying to manage the uncertainty and overwhelming elements of all of this, that I think we have to all have a lot of compassion for how empty our coffee cup really is. And all of us have a very difficult time with emotional regulation in a way where maybe a lot of us don't actually recognize ourselves in the mirror as when we think about who we were 2 years ago. And when we think about the effort that it takes to change our behavior, the effort that it takes to learn something new, you need a full cup. So when you are trying to change your behavior towards a sustainable pattern, when you are trying to adopt new habits that are better for the collective good, and you go to get to work and you get in your car instead of hopping on the train because in that moment in time you need to get in your car, it's because you have an empty coffee cup. And so when we start talking about behavior change, we start talking about the problems that we're solving, thinking about the fact that 72% of behavior is dependent on context and habits, we can start thinking about, okay, how can we actually start building solutions that tackle why change is so hard, meaning that the 72% is basically at the whims of the context at that moment in time. And so what I'm now going to go through with you guys is a bunch of sort of tactics and tools, mostly from the behavioral economics principle toolkit, that have been shown to be tried and true in closing that gap, right? Especially in times of stress or times of fatigue, where we tend to deviate from our value set or from our intentions. The first one I want to talk about is priming. Priming is a well-known principle, I would say, which is really explaining the idea that how we think about and understand a current state can be drastically changed based on how that understanding is basically set up, how it is primed. And so, for example, getting people to write an essay that describes their desired long-term legacy significantly increases donations to environmental organizations today. So getting people to think about their future selves and articulate what they want their legacy to be changes their decision to donate to an environmental organization today. It's a long-term priming to change the way that they behave today. The next example with priming, for example, imagining feeling proud or guilty about pro-environmental decisions makes people more likely to then subsequently choose a green option amongst a bunch of different alternatives. So whereas before we were priming with an action, we're priming with people to think about a future state, you can also prime emotional states. So if you prime people to feel guilty or to feel proud about their decisions, it then changes their ability or their likelihood to actually choose a sustainable or green option amongst alternatives. And again, these are all controlled studies, so it's relative to people who do not have that priming. The second principle is something called friction. And I think we all understand this intuitively in our day-to-day, which is a friction is any additional task or effort that is required to get to an end state. The higher the friction, the less likely we are to actually complete it. I think all of us can come to mind a number of different examples where this would be very true. An example here is a campaign in the Bahamas actually provided size gauges to help fishers catch only mature lobsters, and it actually led to 0 undersized lobsters being caught for the first time in 40 years. And the reason why this is a friction example is because the reducing of the size of the gauge actually took out the effort that was required on the fisherman's side to understand whether or not a fish was large or small. It was an automatic reduction that reduced the effort in terms of having to actually make that decision live. The next opportunity around friction, for example, specializing recycling container lids that actually increased beverage recycling rates by 34% because it made it easier for people to understand what actual type of waste belonged in which waste bin. And I think a lot of us have seen these, the paper bins that are super thin. You've got the cans that are circle. And some of us sit there and we're like, oh man, my square container won't fit in that round bin, but I'm certain it goes in this round bin. We're actually not correct in that situation, and it creates a lot of delays and obstacles in the actual recycling process. So you're modifying and creating better behaviors by default reducing the friction of having to choose which bin is actually correct. The next example of a principle is defaults. And this is very closely aligned to the results or the examples that I just gave you on friction. But default effectively is making the choice for somebody. Now, there's a lot of tricky ethical components here. I'm happy to take some questions on that after. But a great example of this is making double-sided printing the default option. You know, we all think about this in the office back in the day when we used to be in, but it actually leads to a 45% decrease in paper usage, which in this particular study was the equivalent of saving 1,280 trees. So again, it's not that people want to use more paper. It's just they don't necessarily think to actually click that double printing tab. Do that for them, take it out of the equation, and you get significant results. Another example of defaults is defaulting customers into a renewable electricity tariff led to a 10 times increase in the number of customers who were using green electricity. So again, make the decision very easy. Another example, replacing 8,000 employees' desk-side trash bins with smaller bins led to a 50% decrease in trash collection and a 6.3% increase in recycling. Because again, you've got that can or coffee cup in the afternoon, your trash bin is already full. If it was large, you would have maybe just thrown it in there for convenience sake. By making it smaller, you are forcing people to actually make the default decision to then go and put it in the proper recycling bin. The next principle is something called intention prompts. And this is similar to priming, but it's actually prompting active thought and active choice prior to a behavior actually occurring. This is one of the more classic examples. I think maybe a lot of you have seen this example before, where hotel guests that are actually prompted to make an open commitment to conserve more at check-in were 40% more likely to reuse their towels. And again, they may be, this is a control condition, so they wouldn't have necessarily reused already, but the concierge at check-in saying, are you going to be reusing your towels in order to conserve? Prompting somebody to then form an intention, which they then were more likely to follow through on to as much as 40%. Something very simple, but quite big. Another example is compared to farmers who only received feedback. Farmers who also made a public commitment were more likely to adopt sustainable farming practices. And this is with a prompt to actually do so. So this is a call out to the farming community, prompting them to then form an intention to then create a public commitment, which then of course drives the actual execution because of a number of social biases that get people to follow through. Now, it's one thing to prompt an intention, and we know that prompting intention at the most basic level can lead to a 28% likelihood that will actually follow through. One of the ways that you can get people to follow through is through something called an implementation intention. This is a very academic term for a way of talking about people actually making a foundational plan to follow through on their intentions. A great example of this, you can say at the beginning of the year that you're going to work out more. You tend to fall to the side. You can significantly increase the likelihood of that happening by creating an implementation intention where you are deciding that I'm going to go to the gym on Tuesdays at 6 p.m. And that's your plan. And it's very simple and it's concrete and it's got time allocations and effort allocations. and it makes you more likely to stick to your goal. When we talk about this with regards to intentions for employees, for example, employees that spent the time actually planning out their recycling behaviors decreased their waste by 80% compared to those who did not. When we talk about behavioral economics principles, I think one of the ones that I hear the most is social proof, or this idea, X number of people like you do this, and so therefore you're more likely to. There actually is a more nuanced understanding to some of these social influences on people closing that gap between the intention and their actual behavior. I've parsed it apart for you guys, or created some parsing there that I think is meaningful, because social influence in general is a very strong way to change behavior. I think a lot of us foundationally understand this. We maybe have all been through high school and understood what peer influence means at the most sort of salient time at our emotional development as people. And that's really because one of the most dominant forces on the evolution of the brain over the last million years has been social dynamics and social influences. And that's because as a human race, we are better together than we are apart. As much as sometimes it might not seem like that. Collectively, we survive. Individually, we wither. And so social dynamics are incredibly powerful on the direct and the indirect level in terms of how we behave. So one of the first principles around social guidance is providing people with guidance on a decision that should be made when they aren't quite sure on how to make that decision. I think one of the reasons, or one of the things that can speak to the power of this, is that 35% of Amazon's revenue comes from the recommendation engine. Now, I didn't want to put an Amazon photo of the company, so I chose a photo more beautiful for you guys of the actual trees. But that speaks to the power of when you're unsure of whether or not to buy a product, and then you have the recommendations of all the other people just like you who have bought that same product, you're going to be more likely to say, you know what, I haven't seen it before, but I'm going to be more likely to actually buy it because all these other people have bought it as well. Another example of social guidance: converting 25% of the an employee population to adopt a new way of working is the tipping point to creating systematic change. And that's often because openness to change or aversion to change is what drives a lot of our day-to-day working behaviors, because working behaviors are naturally ingrained more in habits, arguably, than a lot of the rest of our life. And there's a lot of dynamics around error and concern of messing up, and that learning curve is monitored so closely in a way that is very different than the rest of our life, where if you have 25% that have made that leap over, it shows everyone else that it is the right pathway forward and is more likely to create that social guidance cue. Another example: the most influential factor for whether or not somebody will purchase solar panels is dependent on whether solar panels exist in neighboring homes or other homes within the neighborhood. So again, solar panels, maybe I don't have the technical expertise to really understand. Maybe they're hard to implement. Maybe, I don't have enough technical knowledge to even know where to begin. But if I see that somebody else has done it, I'm going to be more likely to follow through with that intention and actually put in the effort to go through and do that. Another type of example, or another example of a social tactic, is what we call social anchoring. And that's really understanding the base rate probability of how other people behave. We have a general inability to appropriately calculate base rate probabilities. It's actually the base rate probability fallacy. That's what it's called. You can socially anchor individuals on base rate probabilities. For example, telling people about the average amount that other people donated to a national park led to more people being likely to donate themselves. And again, it's because that base rate probability around anchoring is probably incorrect and very biased based on our own experiences and our own preferences and need to self-rationalize. Another type of social tactic is social persuasion. This is the more aggressive tactic of social influence. This is pushing people to make a decision that they maybe wouldn't have made on their own. Obviously, again, number of ethical considerations, and the moral compass has to be accurately calibrated, if you will, when these tactics are being used. But for example, farmers who received information that 80% of other farmers intended to continue with their sustainable practices increased the likelihood that those farmers would in turn continue their sustainable practices by 18%. Another tactic is called framing. And you'll notice that there's some overlap between these principles, and that's because the brain is a highly integrated structure. And so naturally you will have overlapping concepts. But framing is the idea that all of the value that we attribute to an object or a person or a thing is dependent on how we frame that value relative to the alternatives around it. So one of my favorite examples of framing, because it's hilarious, is that using the term fresh in front of Florida oranges increased consumption by 20%. Again, you know that the oranges are fresh, but framing it in fresh changes the value dynamic and therefore increases likelihood of consumption by 20%. Another example, replacing labels like vegetarian with field grown actually made non-vegetarians more likely to order vegetarian dishes in a restaurant. And again, that's because the idea of field grown is great. It's organic, it's farm to table. Vegetarian carries all the baggage that comes with what it means to be vegetarian and the vegetarian notion of, culinary complexity and all this kind of stuff, but can have a significant effect on how people think about value. And so I'm hoping that having shown you in this talk so far, this idea that there are predictable patterns in behavior. One of the most predictable is this idea that there's a gap between our intention and our values and our actual behavior, but that there's also predictable elements or contexts in which that gap will be wide and when that gap will be narrow. Anxiety and stress and overload and uncertainty being one of the dominant factors in actually driving that. And that I hope that some of the tactics that I've shown you have helped us better understand how you can actually close that gap so that people are more likely to follow through with their intentions. And I hope that when you are thinking about the intention action gap in your day-to-day, you're thinking about it actually as the expectation reality gap as you are planning your strategies and as you are building your pathway forward or your future state. And I hope going forward, you'll spend less time over-indexing on your expectations of how you expect things to happen, and you actually spend more time thinking about that gap, trying to qualify that gap, understand that gap, and fundamentally close that gap with your roadmap and implementation plan towards the future state. And so with that, I will close off. I feel like I've been talking for 3 hours. I think it's been about 30 minutes. But I think we've got 8 minutes left or something for question and answer, if that's allowed. I'm not sure what our protocols are here.
It's absolutely allowed. Thank you so much, Melania. That was outstanding. We do have some questions, so if you're up for it, Melania, sure. I'll plow through a few of these. Let me pick. Asan's got a question here. Let me read it to you.
Sure.
What does this cognitive gap mean for products, especially those that are based on AI, which may elicit a higher expectation from the consumer? And it's you should be able to read it there as well.
I can. This is incredibly sophisticated. When I think, I'm assuming that that when we're talking about products, we're talking about product design and product innovation and how we think about the conceptualization of products before they go to market.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's the case, what we have been working on intensively, and one of the joys of working at IBM is I get to sit at a front row seat of product innovation at all levels. And if in that case, what we tend to focus on is really narrowing in what are some of our assumptions that are driving the viability expectations of this product. When you are actually building a product, you have some foundational assumptions about how that is going to survive in the market, how it's going to thrive in the market, and how it's going to differentiate from competitors and be adopted. And adopted, that's a capital A. That means purchased, that means consumed, that means used, etc. Using those behavioral frameworks and the gap frameworks allows us to better understand the intentions that are driving the parameters on which that product is being built. How much are those parameters, how much weight should those parameters actually have in the development of the product based on the degree to which we think those intentions are actually going to be true in the purchasing or the consumption context. I hope that made sense.
Certainly did. Yes.
Okay.
Thanks very much for that. I'm not going to make you guess where this next one came from. Behavioral science looks at context. How important is location in comparison to other context variables? Gee, I wonder who asked that question.
I wonder who that could be. Must be Arthur. If I remember you and what you love to geek out on the most, and of course the conference that we are in, location means everything, because location not only is a spot on a map, it is the spot on that map encompasses temperature, it encompasses time of day, it encompasses the people who are in that space with you, it encompasses the commercial context that is influencing your decision making. Location is it's a dominant factor, because usually it's the foundational principle on which all these other social, cognitive, and emotional factors sit. It is a time and place.
Very good. Thank you for that, and thank you for chasing down something that we worked on together at one point. So that's awesome. This one, I made this one up, but it's drawn from comments that we've seen in the conference so far, and it's about connecting the climate change intentions with reality. And you know, I think most of the audience here would be seeing that there is a gap. We have great intentions with respect to climate change, and then we go out and we get in our 6.2 liter pickup truck and burn a whole bunch of gas. So can you connect those two?
Yeah. And with this, I do just want to say we have to hold deep compassion for the fact that we are trying our best, but we are humans, and sometimes we will make these decisions that are not aligned to the greater good. And that is why we have to rely on sometimes the blunt instruments of government and tax incentives, or cap and trade style incentives, where you won't get in your car if it reaches a fundamental threshold in which getting into that car is going to hurt you and your purse strings more than getting into a train. And as a society, we are not there yet, I think, in our comfort level on the degree to which government or institutions or private sector has control over what our choices fundamentally are. And so that's a very high level response to say the gap is going to exist until we no longer can really make that decision. Either that means our institutions have forced a certain decision parameter or narrowed it extensively for us, or the state of the climate has reached a point where it is more salient than our ego and our sense of self. And I'm a little scared for what the environment would have to look like in order for that to be the dominant factor. So let's hope our institutions get it right.
We have the factor of the Russian oil, which is another coercing point, right?
Yes, absolutely. But in the meantime, try your best and just have compassion for yourself when you fail, and wake up in the morning and try again. That's the basics.
Great. So speaking of stress and fatigue, so I made a note about anxiety, stress, and fatigue, and I think we all kind of feel that I can certainly sympathize with that. But then the question that came to my mind was, how do you top up the tank? I mean, if you've reached 3:45, 3:49 in the afternoon, the tank is starting to be a bit dry. How do you
Well,
drop
it's empty. Yeah. It's a great question. I'm somebody who's a yoga and meditation geek. Spent a long time in my PhD actually studying the influence of meditation on cognitive architecture and cognitive capacity. And it might sound, uh, you know, yoga guru-ish, or maybe a little too soft, but fundamentally rest and relaxation and time with family and time with friends and balance and exercise is incredibly important. The only way you can refill that cup is either you have anaerobic exercise and you work out and it refills the tank, or you refill through I don't want to say spiritual, but emotionally enlightening things like spending time with people who really matter and turning off your laptop when the workday is done and having your rituals at the beginning, at the end of the day. It's not that complicated. It's just society's not so great at allowing us to do so. I wish I had a hack for you, but the hacks that I talked about are, the small little tactics that you can do, but fundamentally you only refill your cup by resting, recharging.
I've got one last one here, Melania. This one's a little bit tricky, but you were talking about defaults at one point. So one of the defaults that's very interesting to this audience is the default of turning on location tracking in a mobile phone. I'm interested in your thoughts, and is that fit into the default story, or is that a different part of the story?
Well, the defaults used to be there, and now you are asked permission at some moment in time. Now, it might be when you are onboarding, you might not read all the T's and C's, and you might say yes. But I would say, even since we have met, Arthur, the maturity of that choice architecture has fundamentally changed because defaults have issues. Now, I would argue most people will say yes to location defaults if the rewards that they get or the feedback that they get in their experience warrants it. So the greater we get at building our models that allow us to leverage location insights to then create a more rich life for the individuals on the other side, you can take that maturity curve even further to the point where you don't need to ask people again, because the experience it is providing is worth a worthy trade-off.
Outstanding. And with that, I think we'll let you off the hook. That's we've dealt with all the questions there, and that's brilliant. So, Melania, thanks again so much for this. I'm picking up readout from the audience that this resonated very well. So, thanks so much for your time. Thanks for the presentation, and I will close off the Light Conference here as well. We've completed the 4 days, and if you've completed the journey with us, I hope that you found it useful, interesting, compelling, and we do intend to put a survey out to see how people reacted to it, things that we can fix. Let me put one plug in that we have every intention of having another Light Conference towards the end of the year, and this one we're thinking about doing with respect to digital twins and making it a global conference as opposed to just a Canadian conference. So please keep an eye open for that. And I think with that, I will close off the conference and thank you all for the attention you've paid. And I hope that this was a useful and interesting use of your time. Thanks, everybody.